tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So at the very beginning of the flowering of Dharma that came to be called the Mahāyāna, there was this beautiful exploration that happened in several different monastic centers, potentially in Central or South India. It began first, is one idea. And it seems to have launched off of the way that in the early tradition there began to be an emphasis on seeing the characteristics of things, of phenomena, the three classical characteristics of impermanence, anicca, unsatisfactoriness, dukkha, and selflessness, anatta, that these characteristics or marks, they're called lakkhana, it's a mark, that phenomena are marked by these things. So a phenomena is something that's arising. So through any of the physical senses or the heart-mind, something is happening. And if you don't automatically separate things into like this is a thought and this is an object, what you have actually is just a sensory experience. Oh, there's an energy in the body, or there's a sensation, or there's an image arising. And each of these arisings can be analyzed by giving it intimate attention. And when we give them intimate attention, both individual arisings and the stream of constantly, new things arising, what's noticed then is that things are changing all the time, subtly different moment to moment. Even things that seem solid are subtly different moment to moment, right? Even if you have an object that is, unbroken, exactly the same as it was the moment before. This teacup, it's the same teacup, nothing is broken, it hasn't changed, there's not more or less tea in it than there was a moment ago. But I know that this teacup is a moment older. I can see that the light on the teacup is a little different. And my body in relation to the teacup is a little different. My experience of the teacup is slightly different. Even if I conceptually have the idea like that's a stable, consistent object for a while. The experience of it is that something has changed. I'm not as attracted to it as I was 5 minutes ago, or I'm more attracted to it. Oh, I suddenly notice my lovely teacup, whatever. The composite experience of that phenomena arising has changed. Because it changes, there's unsatisfactoriness, dukkha, right? I can't preserve the delight that I first had in the teacup when I was first given it. That delight changes over time. Sometimes it seems to increase, it seems to decrease, but whatever the state is, I can't preserve it intentionally, right? You can't make a feeling or an experience persist. You try to hold on to a feeling, it changes. You try to keep an object safe and unchanged, it changes. The world changes around it, you change, it changes. You can't do it. Because of that, there's a thing that the heart seems to want, which would be satisfaction or certainty, right? The opposite of dukkha, the unsatisfactory, is sukha, the satisfying, the easeful, the peaceful, the delightful, the pleasurable, right? I want the thing to stay the way I want it to stay, but it just doesn't. And so anicca and dukkha are intimately connected. Because of anicca, dukkha. right? And then it goes further, and it says, because of both of these things, phenomena, and again, that's the experience arising, is marked by anatta, by that experience. So that means that object or myself or the moment of perception cannot be a thing that I would call myself or a soul. And I can't even really call it my possession, right? I would like to say that I possess the teacup in this moment in a kind of temporary, socially agreed upon way. I do. But, I possessed a very nice pink shirt, and I, in a moment of non-mindfulness, I believe anyway, that I left it at an Airbnb somewhere in the Sierras a month and a half ago, and it's gone. It's no longer my shirt. Or if it is in name only. But the thing that it was, which was my favorite shirt that I wore every, once in a while, has changed. I'm a little unsatisfied about that, and it would be a cause of further suffering for me to think of it as mine or, myself. I'm identified with the pink shirt. It makes me feel more, whatever, Hispanic, queer, hip, attractive, 53-year-old. I don't know. At different times it did all those different things. And now it's gone, Everything is marked by that. Everything is marked by the impossibility of it truly being myself, my possession, or my eternal soul. There's just nothing I can put my finger on that has those characteristics of I, me, mine, or a self or a soul. So that's the characteristics, right? They're called the Tilakkhana, the 3 marks. Very deep teaching, all the way back to the beginning of the Buddha's teaching. All of the aspects of our experience are marked by these 3 things. That teaching then mixes with, or hold that teaching in one hand. Now here's a teaching that the Buddha gives in a very important discourse. And again, this is in the Pali Canon. This is in the early layer, non-Mahāyāna, perhaps, layer of the texts. And this is in a discourse called the Shorter Discourse on Emptiness, the Chula Sunyata Sutta. Sunyata is emptiness. Sunya means empty. Sunyata is like the characteristic of emptiness. So emptiness, in a way, is another characteristic. It's a mark. Things are marked by emptiness. And you'll see that language appear in the Mahāyāna. In the Discourse on Emptiness, the Buddha says, out here in the wilderness, he's giving the talk in the forest, outside of town. So out here in the wilderness, it's so peaceful. Notice how peaceful it is. And notice that there are things that are not here. For instance, the noise and bustle of the city is not here. In the same way that you could see an empty building, and you could notice that there are no horses in it. It's a barn. The horses have left the barn. And you can see that there are no horses in it. In just this way, this forest grove is empty of the perception of city, empty of the perception of noise. So in a way, this is very simple. The experience of a moment is empty of whatever is not there, right? I'm alone here in my office. My office is empty of the perception of other people. And so from this, however, and the teaching on the Shorter Discourse on Emptiness, it really becomes a meditation on absence. And that meditation on absence leads to a kind of samadhi, or a steadied, balanced state of mind that is attending to the peacefulness of things not being there. So emptiness in the in the Chula Sunyata Sutta, the shorter discourse on emptiness, is, I think it's Majjhima 121. I'll put a link to it under the Facebook post, or under the announcement for the talk. In the shorter discourse on emptiness, emptiness is not like a cosmic metaphysical characteristic that is the condition of everything. It's going to become that, so we'll get there in a few minutes. But in the beginning, it's just a meditation on tranquility, essentially. And so you would say, oh, I notice that the busyness of the city is not here because I'm in the wilderness. I can tune into that absence, and my nervous system quiets down a little bit. It's peaceful, right? It's really a meditation on peacefulness. So if you have access to, a place where you go that's outside of the city and it's peaceful, when you go there sometimes, maybe you notice, like, oh, here's the perception of the city and its busyness, and then I go to this other place that's more peaceful, and I can feel the quiet. We lived in Oakland in the East Bay for a long time. One of our favorite places was Redwood Regional Park up in the hills, and there was a trail there, the French Trail, that is just lovely. It's a lovely trail, and I would be on it. It was one of the lesser traveled trails, because someone at one point told me to take the trail less traveled. When two paths diverge in a wood, you take the one that's less traveled. It makes all the difference, so they say. Robert Frost, of course. The French Trail kind of cuts down the hillside at this like marvelous diagonal. It's a thin little track through the trees, and I would go there, and I would notice that it was peaceful. I would notice that I had come out of the busyness of my neighborhood in North Oakland, and I had entered the trees, and you could feel the quiet, you could feel the space, you could feel the absence of people being nearby, or the more spread outness of the people and dogs and all that. And say, oh, this French Trail in Redwood Regional is empty of the perception of North Oakland, empty of the perception of Temescal, empty of, those are just the neighborhoods that I was in, empty of the perception of busyness. And so you notice the absence, and there's a kind of peacefulness. So this is the beginning of the concept of emptiness, and it begins to join then the three traditional marks as another thing that phenomena are marked by. Because notice, if you take the marks, particularly the mark of anatta, selflessness, experiences can't be marked with being myself or my possession or my soul. The experience then of this moment of, let's say, my body is empty of the perception of something that's not there. And the thing that's not there is the soul, is the self, is the mine-ness. Right? So anatta is very close to emptiness. Anatta is the perception that this experience of the body can't really be called my eternal home, my true self. Right? And as this develops into the Mahāyāna, you're going to see a term for one's own being, and the term is svabhava. Sva means like one's own or oneself, and bhava means being or becoming. Svabhava it's a little bit like, and I don't want to do too much cross-cultural comparison, but it's a little bit like the thing in itself from Heidegger, which itself grew out of Kant in European philosophy. The idea was that in the thing, let's say the teacup, there's a kind of essence that is the thing in itself, separate from any other relationality or changing phenomena, that there's a thing, right? And it has a kind of eternal nature. This goes all the way back to Plato and the idea or the ideals, that there's a thing, that there's a cosmic kind of perpetual concept that you might call cup. And regardless of the many individual manifestations of cup, there's a cupness that you recognize when a thing is doing cupness. You can say that's a cup, and it's kind of partaking of this eternal essential nature called cup. Now, postmodern philosophy has blown that out of the water. Everything is far more complicated than that, not least because translation. And there's not an eternal concept of cup, for instance, that is the same as the eternal concept tasse, which is cup in French. Because, a tasse and a cup are just two different things. They're different words, they're different cultures, they have different mythos associated with them. And there are some things that the French would call a tasse and I wouldn't call it a cup, and vice versa. And of course, any number of artists have deconstructed cup, and you're like, that's not a cup. But the plaque on the museum wall says cup, So what those artists and postmodernism are realizing partly is emptiness, right? Emptiness is a way of saying that there is actually not a thing in itself. There is not an idea or an ideal that this thing traces back to that is somehow eternal, pure, and consistent. And that that's true for us as beings, most centrally. That there's not a thing that you could say, this is myself. Forever and always, it's like this. It's my soul. And it survives the death of the body, and it always existed before the body. The Buddha would say, you can't find that thing. He doesn't say, by the way, he doesn't say that it doesn't exist. He doesn't really use language like exists or not exists. Those two are extremes of thought, and they're both just ideas. To say something exists or doesn't exist is a way of using language to try to describe something that doesn't actually fall into either of those categories. Because the words exist and not exist are also empty. They're cultural, they're conditioned, what they mean changes over time. And what the Buddha would say is not that a thing exists or doesn't exist, like yourself or your soul or your true nature, your svabhava. What he would say is you can't find it in any particular experience. So every particular experience is marked by impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, selflessness, and it's empty. It's empty of svabhava, empty of a fixed self. So I think it's good not to get too lost in abstraction, but to try this out. And so one way you might try it out is you might see if you can find it. So here you are sitting in, geeky Dharma class, and we're talking about svabhava or whatever, soul and true nature. And the proposal here is that if you look for the thing you could call yourself, what is it that you come across? And so try that out. Here you are. You don't have to do anything particular because it's here or not. See if you can place your attention for a moment on the sense of being you. You know you're you, and you're not somebody else. So what is it that you're noticing? What is it that you could notice in this moment that gives you the sense of being you? We'll do this in a couple of steps, but just that first step, let's see. If you're willing to be on the recording, let's hear a couple people, just if you wanted to say just a couple words of like, what is that? How would you describe that thing where like, oh yeah, that's what I'm noticing when I tune into the like, this is me. Yeah, Liz.
A continuum of attitude.
A continuum of attitude. That's a great phrase. Yep, yep. Amy, did you have your hand up?
It was even hard to play along with the experiment because immediately I'm like, well, the word you is empty. So what are you saying when you ask me how to?
That's right. That's right. I already undercut. I already gave the punchline of the exercise. Yeah.
So I couldn't do it. I just chuckled.
There you go. There you go. You get your Dharma nerd badge for that one. It's true. For me, what part of what happens, I think I think for me it's a little bit like, Liz, what you said. Like there's a kind of continuum. It feels like it has been going. It's familiar, right? That's part of what gives the sense of continuum. There's a familiarity, and attitude is something like, for me, it's something like a tone. There's like a recognizable tone to my presence, and it's I think it's the thing that I feel like is me, because I could imagine it feeling different, but it never has in a certain way. And then we're going to get to that one in a moment. But like there's a sense of like, I tune into a thing that feels like, well, it gets really tautological. It just feels like me. And there's a kind of tone there. So that's a little bit how I might try to describe that. Anyone want to give more words to that? Or different kinds of words to that perception?
Mine was a sense of familiarity in the body.
Yeah.
Like there's something that it's as if it's been here since I was born.
Mm-hmm.
And some sense of being in this body, even though the body's very different now.
Yeah.
But some thread of continuity.
Yep. Yep. Right. So you can get a sense of continuity in the kind of attitudinal or mental emotional channel, and you could also get a sense of continuity through the somatic or the bodily channel. Yeah. And Caitlin, were you going to say something? And I'm also getting a couple of notes in the chat. I think some of them are coming just to me, so you can't see them, but one of them just says habit. And I think that's really deep, actually. Like, right, this thing where I'm perceiving continuity, it is a kind of habit. Habit, in a certain way, is very close to recognition. Like, there's something that I recognize about something, which is why how I might call it a habit. So yeah, myself in a certain way is a habit. Caitlin.
Yeah, Liz pretty much said what I was going to say, which was body sensations that are so familiar. I can't remember when they first started.
Yeah.
Aspects of my physical body, but I feel you really. The first thing I noticed, you very much described just that, which and is very hard to describe. Just
Yep.
Tone of this is me.
Yeah. So here's the second half of the exploration then. So try this on if you want to. Touch in again to whatever it is you touched into the first time, that tone or continuum or habitual or familiar sense of me, myself, either through attitude, energy, emotional presence, or through the body. So there's something familiar here. Feels continuous. And now, see if you ask yourself the question if it's always felt like this. And one way to do that might be to flash back, like snapshot into other parts of your life. And you could get dramatic and think of yourself as a very young child, but really anywhere in your life. And see if you can remember it, whatever this is, feeling different. The tone of myself having different qualities, or even being quite substantially different. And again, see what you might notice about that. When I do this one, and we'll do the same, hear from a couple folks if you want. When I do this one, the first thing I notice is that the present moment, like tone, I notice that it has a certain flavor, almost like an emotional flavor. Like there's a general state that I'm in this phase of my life. And if I flash back far enough, I get a really different, like emotional, energetic tone. Like there's a different zing of anxiety or self-consciousness, for instance, I can tune into. That fluctuated, but that was strong enough and consistent enough that it colored my sense of who I was. Like, this is who I am at another point in my life. And that tone is actually absent right now or has changed to something else. And so that's one way that tone feels different. I can tease those apart as two different things, and that's interesting. I can be like, yeah, but there's just the sense of being an individual or a person existing, and then on top of that or around that, I can feel this like changing emotional, energetic tone. So I think there's that. But how it initially feels actually is that those two are quite merged, that my sense of who I am is really tied up in how I feel, how I perceive the world and myself in it through a kind of lens. And that lens is a little bit of a state, it has to do with my happiness or sadness, my different, changing states, not moment to moment, but in big arcs through my life, right? So you might think back to like your early 20s, your marvelous, dramatic, volatile feeling state of your early 20s, or whenever that was for you. And then, yeah, any reflections on the sense of myself feeling different at a different time? Yeah, Kylie.
Primarily for me, it has just to do with the fundamental sense of waking up. Like less self-consciousness, more actual consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And with that is, for me, a deep sense of self-compassion that hitherto was absent.
Yeah.
That's what hits me.
Yeah. Great. Liz.
I feel completely different this afternoon from the way I feel now.
Mm-hmm.
The emotional tone and the feeling in my body. It was almost like a different person.
Yeah.
A different personality.
Yeah. So it's great to recognize that, particularly when we can sense it not just as a change in my state, but that it feels like it goes that deep. It's like a change in my personality. It's like, I felt, almost like a different person.
Yes, I do.
Then, yeah.
I do.
Yeah. Any other reflections?
For me, there's still this kind of parallel track of being able to connect with a completely different kind of energy and sense, and at the same time that other consistent thing, whatever it is, still running parallel to the change. So there's something consistent and something that's different.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think, I think partly this is why, because that underlying sense, we can perceive, you can get very subtle with changing states and emotional, energies, and even kind of how the personality is responding to the world over the course of phases of life. But there can be the sense that substrate of me, even just the thing that the concept of me points to or is an experience of, that can feel very consistent, right? And in a certain way, I'm not trying to encourage you to not feel that. Feeling that is a common definition of being sane, for instance. Like having a consistent sense of self. If you really don't have that, and like not in the awakening way, but in the kind of disorganized way, it's really a problem. So that's, we're touching into a very deep layer of the psyche. But you can perceive that there's that deep substrate that's fairly consistent, and the inquiry the meditation becomes to really deconstruct experience to the point where you're starting to challenge the perception of that thing's consistency, right? So you take apart in meditation the body into all of its parts, and so that you don't nurture the sense that this is me, this body. You're like, well, here's the head hair, the body hair, the nails, teeth, skin. That's the first 5 in the sequence. And you just you imagine like almost like you could take them off. I went to the barber today. I did take some of it off, and there's a pile of gray and black hair on the floor, and oh, there's head hair and beard hair, nails, teeth, skin, like organs and fluids and all the things, and you separate them out. You separate the body out into the cardinal elements. But you also do mindfulness that connects you with the stream of time. And so one of these that we've done this a little bit, I haven't done it in a long time, but you do this kind of meditation where you connect with the sense of the stream of yourself, and then you see how far back in your life you can remember, and so you get back to the edge of the infant amnesia. So you see if you can remember yourself when you were 5, and then when you were 4, and and you drop the numbers and you just start to see if you can get a flash of the earliest memories. And often we do this through, you could do this through looking at old family, photographs, like seeing, oh yeah, that room, that coffee table where they tell me I learned to walk. And you could just look at it and then see it, I've seen pictures of that coffee table, and then I try to remember what it was like when the top of the table came up to my chest and I held onto it. And just try to remember that, right? The Buddha becomes liberated by remembering his past lives. And the method for that is to, it's not mystical per se, like you're getting a spontaneous vision. It's really remembering back through infancy to the womb, and then to conception, and then across the moment of conception to the death moment. And this is a very particular Buddhist meditation to find the moment where, in the Theravada understanding, there's a death moment, and then immediately following is a birth moment, there's a conception moment, and that there are meditations. It takes a lot of concentration to do this, but there are people around who can do this and who can teach you. The meditation is to go back and forth across that moment until you really get good at noticing it. And then you can notice, oh, I was in this kind of body and I died in this way. And then I entered this womb, the womb of my current mother. And you go back over it, and then you go back forward over it, and back over it. And then you scroll back through the last life, and you get to the birth moment of the last one. And again, you cross over into the death moment and back into the birth moment. And whether or not you think that rebirth is a material reality or a mythic kind of layer of consciousness that's more dreamlike or imaginative, I think it's actually fine to have the concept of past lives being either material or mythic, or deep consciousness. That's fine. But the fact of the practice is that you can do this, and you can go back and forth across this thing. And so the proposal here is that perception of my continuous self is actually, it can be fairly continuous through this lifetime, but actually there's a breakage to the last lifetime where that sense is very different in a different body. The somatic sense breaks. And the sense here is that because all of the conditions surrounding this sense of being a self change, that thing that we're perceiving, it actually doesn't qualify for being called a self or a soul. And those are two translations of the same word. The Pali word is atta. The familiar Sanskrit word, if any of you are in the yoga traditions, is atman. The Hindu or Vedantic conception of the Atman is of a continuous self or soul that puts on and takes off bodies like outfits of clothing. The Buddhist conception is different. The Buddhist conception is that the Atta or the Atman is a concept that cannot be found in any particular experience. And so you can't find anything to pin with that word, Atta. And the early German translators, and then the English that translated from that, called it a self, partly because they were coming from Christian theology and they were uncomfortable calling it a soul. It didn't seem to quite match soul. I actually think soul is a better translation of Atta or Atman than self, because self feels really psychological. It's like, well, I have a self that's bound up with the events of this lifetime and this body and these emotions. And in that sense, it's a useful word. But soul is a conceptual projection of immortality. And that's the thing the Buddha says, it's not there, right? That nothing bears that characteristic. So one last step here then. As these concepts developed, they developed into a theory of what came to be called momentariness. And this is the core, this is one of the core existential, in a way, theories in the Theravada, that nothing lasts for more than a moment. And a moment here is a word for saying the smallest division of time that can't be further divided. So you might be like, there's no, it's turtles all the way down here. And so you can go there and you could say that moment is just a conceptual category, meaning, infinitely small. And that's fine. But the idea came to be that because conditions are constantly changing and nothing can be said to have a soul that persists between changing moments, therefore each moment is radically disconnected from those surrounding it, because there can't be anything that strings them together other than causation. This moment, is a condition for the next moment. But there's no substance, there's no svabhava that strings them together. A soul would string them together. I, the soul, is perceiving all these things. Or there's a God. And this is where Vedanta went. It's like, oh, there's an individual soul, but actually the individual soul is not separate from God. God is a permanent, singular, unchanging Atman. And the individual soul is actually not different from that. that solves some thorny philosophical problems, because if individual souls were fundamentally different from God, they could never be in relationship, and God would not be universal then, because God would be separated from your soul. Therefore, the individual soul has to just think that it's individual, but it's illusory. And what it actually is just partaking in the singular, eternal oneness that is God, Brahma. So that's Vedanta. That was around. That was developing in the same time as the Buddha. The Buddha had a similar but importantly different theory. And his theory was that there's no universal, singular Atman that can be found. And so each moment conditions the next, and each lifetime conditions the next, the way a rolling object, like a ball, like a billiard ball, hits another object and transfers its momentum into that other object. The momentum is not a soul, right? The momentum is just energy that passed into the object temporarily because it came from somewhere else. But the energy was transferred from one body to the next body, and it continued. That energy is karma, and it's your actions. So actions become a kind of force that moves from one body to the next. And the most fundamental way that force moves from one body to the next is through giving birth. It's partly why sexuality is so fundamentally important in the system, but also I think in a certain way, procreation and birth giving is existentially central to the entire thing, which is why ending rebirth is at the heart of the concept of liberation. Right? When one body passes its life force into another body and that body continues beyond it, there's a kind of force moving on into the world. And something profound happens when any being enters celibacy or finishes childbearing, and in the period of life when one is no longer bearing children, so you could decide that early, or you could do this, at any moment near the end of your life, anywhere in the course of your life. If you then not just stop having physical children, but uproot the desire, the craving for further existence that would lead to rebirth, then you've finished your karma, right? You've finished adding force into the world that moves then forward, right? Once you uproot craving, it's kind of a side effect that there's no more rebirth, because there's no more force to compel the ball hitting the next ball. The billiard ball rolls to a stop before it hits the next one, right? That momentum is gone, right? Momentum, if we want to keep going with the thermodynamic metaphor, the momentum goes back into the earth. And I think that's where awakened beings' energy goes, if we want to go there. All right, so I said that I would get to Nāgārjuna. I think all of that was the preparation for getting to Nāgārjuna. So I think I'll end us by reading you just the first verse of the root verses on the middle way, the Mūlamadhyamakakārikā. This is Nāgārjuna's most central text, and the foundational text for all of the Mahāyāna, or much of the Mahāyāna. This is the foundational text for the Madhyamaka school, the middle way school. I generally use Siddharat's and Katsura's translation, but there's lots. Garfield has a good translation as well. There's a bunch of them. But the very beginning of this work starts off from this concept of momentariness, and it's talking about movement and conditions. The very beginning is hard. I'm actually going to skip the beginning. I'm going to go to chapter 2 because it's easier. We'll go back to chapter 1 because I can't do chapter 1 in 1 minute here at the end of things. So this is the beginning of the second chapter. It's easier. So remember the momentariness thing, right? Moment by moment arising. So just as the path traversed is not being traversed, neither is the path not yet traversed being traversed. The path presently being traversed that is distinct from the portions of path traversed and not yet traversed is not being traversed. All right. I said that was the easy verse, right? It is. But here's the idea. The concept that you have of a path is the concept of a continuous thing, along which there's movement. I'm moving along the beginning of the path. Now I'm on the middle of the path. Now I'm further along on the path. I'm on the road between, Sonoma County and Oakland right now, let's say. That idea depends on the idea that the road is a continuous thing, that I could somehow be further along. Oh, I'm here on this continuous thing, and now I'm here on a continuous thing, and now I'm here on a continuous thing. If we keep in mind the characteristics and emptiness and momentariness, wherever I am, it's a conceptual, it's only conceptual, it's illusory in a way to say that there was some path that I was on, and there's some path that I'm going to be on, and even to say that there's a path that's connected to those things that I'm on at this very moment. All I can say in this very moment is that there's the being right here, right now. It's like, oh, in this very moment, there's not traveling. The idea of traveling depends on the concept of some consistent thing moving from one place to another. What if there's no consistent thing? There's just a flash of being here, and a flash of being here, and a flash of being here. And around these flashes of being here, the sights and the sounds and the thoughts and the feelings and the sensations are all changing, have all changed. They're all just different. To even say changed proposes that there's something continuous that is itself changing or morphing. This is why we did the meditation on like the strobe or like arising of phenomena. This is a philosophy that is a working out of the perception of things arising as discontinuous phenomena. And so this is the beginning of what Nāgārjuna will call the middle way. So we'll keep going with this, of course, because that was hardly anything on it. The middle way is the middle way between extremes. And particularly, it's going to be between the extremes of existence and non-existence. But eventually, this is going to be the middle way between any extreme. Right? That momentariness, yes. Discontinuity, yes. But that doesn't mean that we're going to say that there's no such thing as a road or no such thing as a being traversing the road. We're not going to say that the being and the road have an eternal svabhava, an eternal self or a soul, that the soul of the being traverses the path of the road, and that those are distinct existing entities in ongoing relationship. We're not going to say that. Neither are we going to say that nothing exists at all and everything is a wash of meaningless, momentary phenomena without center, without any refuge. Right? So this is really between what in the text would be called eternalism and nihilism. Neither one is going to work philosophically, and importantly, for liberation. For liberation to manifest, you can't fall into either of those extremes. For nihilism, there's nothing to get liberated, right? There's no way to progress on the path. You have to develop the mind with some sense that you are developing something. But if you think that there's anything in you that's completely fixed and unchangeable, that by definition cannot get liberated, because it can't change. And so and so that part, if there were that thing, it could neither be suffering nor liberated, nor experience any changes, nor be any kind of individual. In fact, it could never be anything other than God, if that thing existed. Because if that thing exists, there can only be one of it. And if there's only one of it, then you might as well call it God. And so the Buddha is going to say, without falling into either of those two extremes, I found the middle way. And so Nāgārjuna takes up that statement, which was the very first thing the Buddha said upon his liberation. Without falling into the extremes, I found the middle way. And then he's now going to tease out the implications of that middle way through the lens of emptiness, to begin to understand how we could enter the meditation of radical momentariness in a way that both explains conditionality, how things condition what comes next, and doesn't get caught in the illusion of a self or a soul. Wildly and mysteriously, this is the teaching that will become the Mahāyāna, which will eventually become the teachings on engaged Buddhist practice and reconciling the truths of the radically non-dual and the immanent reality of relationship and the world. So we'll take some weeks and we'll make our way slowly along that path. The question arose, what's the name of this text? It's the root verses on the middle way. And the Siddharit's translation, Mark Siddharit's and Shoryu Katsura that I use is called Nāgārjuna's Middle Way. It's the Wisdom publications. I'll put a link to it in the notes here. And we won't go like verse by verse through Nāgārjuna. Don't worry. But we'll touch in there, and we'll maybe touch into some of the other root texts in the Perfection of Wisdom. Maybe find our way to the Heart Sutra, and we'll see where it takes us. So we'll pause there for now. Blessings to all listening.